Welcome to this mini lecture on environmental ethics. In this section, I really want to do two major things. The first one is I want to give you some basic conceptions, some that we've talked about in ethics before, but some that will be brand new and are specific towards environmental ethics. But I want to, first of all, give you some basic conceptions to help you think about environmental ethics. The second thing I want to do is focus on how the theories that we've learned up to this point can be applied to environmental ethics. And what I'm really kind of hoping to accomplish in this section for this week is that you can start to see how some of the things that we've been discussing over these last 4 weeks in class, how they can be used and modeled to talk about any issue. I want to show you how they can be used to talk about environmental ethics, but I'm hoping that you can look at some of the distinctions that we're going to be making in this week's discussion, and you can see that it could extend to almost any area of ethics that we would want to talk about. So bearing that in mind, I want to start off by pointing out the fact that we are going to focus a lot of the environmental ethics discussion that we're having on consequentialism and agency-based ethics. I will bring in some of the meta-ethics that we learned last week, but a big focus is not going to be on that meta-ethics. It definitely could be, and there are a lot of meta-ethical theories that are used to talk about our responsibility towards the environment. I'm also not going to focus a lot on the deontological arguments that we looked at, but again, those have also been used for environmental ethics. The main reason why I want to focus on consequentialism versus agency-based ethics is because I think that these two contrasting views in a lot of ways can help set up how we think about the environment itself. If you notice, I also took away virtue ethics. And again, this is a place just like deontology or the meta-ethics that we learned last week, where we could talk a lot about environmental ethics. But I think using feminist ethics and the ethics of care as a contrast to the consequentialist ethics that we've already learned serves as again, a good kind of measuring stick for seeing how the different ideas that we've talked about could be applied in environmental ethics. And so with that being said, the first thing I want to talk about is the notion of what's called the problem of the tragedy of the commons. Often this is just called the tragedy of the commons. Sometimes this idea is extended in economics to what's called the free rider problem, and they're similar, but there are some differences between those ideas as well. But the overlap is so great that a lot of people consider them to kind of be the same thing. And what the tragedy of the commons is has a lot to do with what we were talking about in our normative ethics about the prisoner's dilemma. It's basically what you get when you apply the prisoner's dilemma to the environment. You notice that there is this kind of competition that people can have over resources, and in environmental ethics, this is a big question now because there's so many different resources that you don't get by claiming a stake in them, right? You don't like put a flag in the land and say, I claim these resources in the name of, right, whatever country, like it used to happen during the colonial period. Instead, a lot of the resources that have to be managed now are things that have this kind of transmutive quality, right? So air quality, for instance, is a good example of this. There is a certain kind of cooperation that has to exist between countries in order for the quality of air to be sustained. Water quality is another big question. In fact, this is a big question right now in Ethiopia, where a war just kind of broke out because Ethiopia is a fully landlocked country, but has the delta of the Nile at its fingertips. And so it built a dam, which has made many of the Egyptians kind of angry because they rely on the flooding of the Nile for a lot of their agricultural needs. And this, inadvertently allows the Ethiopians to control the Egyptians' um, agriculture. And this is something that's happened many times. That there's plans during the Napoleonic Wars to change the river flow, like in France, right, to gain certain advantages. And really, if we look, even between states themselves, I believe it's still true that Colorado owns, or Texas owns the water table of Colorado. And so, you think about that like the water you drink, right, is managed somewhere. And where it's not managed, you probably don't want to drink it. All of this comes back to the question of, like, well, how do we take these competitive sorts of resources that exist and have some arrangement by which they're taken care of. Now, again, in economics, what a free rider problem is when someone is able to enjoy a benefit without having to put in a burden themselves. They don't have to do anything to reap that benefit. And so that's why there's a lot of times overlap with the tragedy of the commons. But again, the tragedy of the commons is just this idea that when resources are shared as common, like things like air, like things like water, fishing grounds is another good example there that I've got listed. What tends to happen is that free or common resource becomes abused, becomes wasted, and in some cases it even becomes destroyed. And so this is where you see that some parts of the environment become privatized and some parts become public. If you, for instance, have a lake with a lot of fish in it, and you don't want that lake to eventually become like all fished out, one way of dealing with that or regulating that is to do what we do in the United States: force people to get a fishing license, have a steep penalty if you're caught fishing without having a fishing license, and having some sort of regulatory switch that allows for that body of water to not be overfished. And of course, when you open up a lake, right, and just say, hey, like anyone can come here and do whatever they want, then it creates all kinds of problems. And of course, this is the reason why we have limited hunting seasons for deer and things like that as well. So again, one of the first ideas we're going to talk about is just this problem of the tragedy of the commons, often referred to just as the tragedy of the commons, where the ability to share common grounds often leads to a problem that they have to be managed or regulated in some sort of way. Probably the biggest distinction that we can talk about here is whether or not the value of the environment itself is an instrumental or extrinsic value, or whether or not it's an intrinsic value. If you remember when we were talking about utilitarianism and happiness, we discussed this idea about intrinsic value, where happiness, as Mill defined it, was intrinsically valuable. That is, that it's valuable for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. Something that is instrumentally or extrinsically valuable, it's valuable because it helps you get something. It's an instrument for the achievement of something else. And so if you remember, Mill talked about the fact that he thought ethics itself, right, or virtue itself, was really used extrinsically to obtain happiness. And that, again, because happiness is its own value, it's intrinsically valuable, everything that we do is really in pursuit of happiness. Aristotle talks about how the moneymaker's pursuit is instrumentally or extrinsically valuable, that people don't desire to make money just because they find that fulfilling, but it's actually what you do with the money that ultimately makes making money fulfilling, right? And so, you make money so that you can buy a car, or so that you can, get a good education or whatever the reason you make money is. And so in the same way, one of the first distinctions that we should look at, not just in environmental ethics, but any kind of ethical question that you're asking about, right, is whether or not it's intrinsically valuable or it's instrumentally valuable. I mean, when I talk about sexual ethics, this is often a place where we'll begin as well. It's talking about, right, is like sexual activity itself, is it something that is instrumentally valuable? It's used to achieve something else, or is it intrinsically valuable? Is it something that is valuable for its own sake? When we talk about business ethics, this is a good place to start off. Is there some sort of intrinsic value of a company itself, or is it instrumentally valuable? It's really just used again to achieve something else. And again, any type of ethical dilemma that you run into, this is usually a very good starting point. If you haven't already considered it, is ultimately, is this something that is secondary in its importance to you, right? It's intrinsic or extrinsic, right? Or is it instrumental or extrinsic, sorry? Or is it primarily important to you? It's intrinsically valuable. And so when we think about the environment, this is obviously a good question to ask, right? Is the environment itself valuable to human beings, right? To mankind, right? To humanity, because it can be used to achieve humanity's goals. You have to build a house. You have to be able to get from point A to point B somehow. You've got to be able to feed yourself. And so the environment provides all of those different means for us. Or is there something about the environment that gives it its own value? Does it, in other words, maybe transcend human value? And so the brief kind of overview that we could take of this is to talk about these three main concepts. Anthropocentrism, right? I'll say that a couple of times, right? But the main part there is the first word, anthropos, or it's taken from the Greek word anthropos, which means, human. So if you ever think about like anthropology, for instance, that's the study of human beings, right? So anthropocentric point of view says that human beings are at the center of environmental policy. And so the anthropocentric point of view thinks that our relationship to the environment is mostly instrumentally valuable or extrinsically valuable, and that we should really use the environment to promote our own interests. The biocentric view, which is sometimes referred to as the deep ecology view, really says that life is at the center of environmental policy. And so it thinks that the environment is intrinsically valuable insofar as the environment is promoting all of life and sustaining all of life. And human beings are a part of that environment. And so that's the kind of proper consideration that we should have. The ecofeminist point of view looks at the environment as being intrinsically valuable, but it uses that same idea that we talk about in feminism, about the idea that we shouldn't have domination over the environment itself. Our relationship with the environment should not be considered in terms of that kind of power dynamic that we were describing, right? But instead it's this mutual enterprise where what human beings do supports the environment, and the environment supports human life. So we're going to talk about each one of these views a little bit more in depth. But overall, that's a kind of basic distinction you can make between the three. If we take a look for a minute at the beginning part there, the anthropocentric point of view, or what's referred to as anthropocentrism, This is, and that's a good word to throw around if people are wondering, what are you doing in ethics class, right? You'd be like, oh, we just learned about anthropocentrism, right? How about you? But anthropocentrism is, again, this idea that human beings are at the center of the environmental policy. So again, if you can remember that Greek root anthropos means human, right? It's just saying that human beings are at the center of it. And so if you think about this for a moment, it may seem odd, right, to say this, to be like, this is a very like twisted point of view, right? Why would human beings see themselves as the most important in in the environment when there's clearly other considerations to be made? And I would point out a couple of different arguments that we could look at based off of what we've already talked about this semester. And so I'm going to flip over to the next slide really quick and show you some of those. One that's found quite often is this argument of divine command theory, where in Genesis, God gives man dominion over the earth, and people have traditionally interpreted that as being that human beings' interests are primary towards any other kind of interest that exists. I think that the egoist argument is probably one of the most compelling arguments that can be made in this direction, because what it's ultimately saying is, that everything that exists in some way or another has to be somewhat selfish, right? Self-interested, I should say, in their own environment, right? Like the lion is indifferent to the lamb, right, or whatever animal it's going to have to eat, right? If you ever watch like those nature documentaries, like that like nature is somewhat brutal, and like no species decides on its own to just be like, like I'm just going to give up without a fight, right? Like no matter what kind of animal there is that exists. Right, the environment is not fully compatible, is not fully designed to serve their own interests, and so an individual has to kind of adjust for the purpose of serving their own interests. I have listed here, right, like plumbing's not natural. Plumbing is something, right, that we from our own self-interest force onto our environments, and the same could be said of just about every kind of luxury that you enjoy in your life. Like refrigerators aren't natural parts of life, but you're probably very grateful that they exist, even though they use up a lot of energy, right? It's something you're probably not willing to forgo. And so, the baseline argument is just saying, right, like we adapt our behavior to accommodate our life. And so that's the same is true of every other animal, and it's perfectly within our means and perfectly within our capability to be able to pursue our own interests, the same as any other species that exists. Social contract arguments also have sprung up. There was a book a long time ago by Newt Gingrich that was called Contract with the Earth. And in that, he laid down a lot of different ideas centered around this notion of environmental entrepreneurship, where there is an economic opportunity that is involved with green policy, and so this isn't just always this like cutthroat, like let's like burn as many fossil fuels as we can and like destroy like our environment rapidly, but it's actually again this idea that like we can balance out some of the problems that exist when we centralize them towards human beings' existence. If we know that we're destroying our own environment to our own peril, that obviously creates an opportunity for someone to come in and be able to do something. And I would point out that one of the other arguments that goes with this idea is using this language of environmental catastrophe, which has existed for a while, right? Going back before even my time period, right? People talked about, Thomas Mann is probably the first person in the 18th century to propose this idea that the growth of the human population is arithmetic, right? But or geometric, right? But the growth of the food is arithmetic, and so, right, like human existence on Earth is not sustainable over the long haul. And of course, there have been a number of other things, and some of them we'll explore and talk about, right? But the global warming and melting of the ice caps and CO2 emissions and a number of other things, people from an anthropocentric point of view would again point out the fact that, right, if we want meaningful change, we have to not accept the fact that something meaningful cannot be done, right? We have to get past that notion in order to be able to do something meaningful. And so the anthropocentric point of view says, right, like whatever meaningful thing we're going to do, it's going to have to be within the context of helping ourselves before we do anything else. And so often what you see in the anthropocentric point of view is this notion of conservation, right? It's a goal because it stakes a particular interest with anyone who's a rationally self-interested individual. And again, that goes back to that kind of argument about cooperation and that we saw in social contract theory. But those are some of the arguments. Those are clearly not all of the arguments. And again, we'll explore some more of those. But often people who have an anthropocentric point of view in environmental ethics, that they tend to still be pretty strong conservationists, and not people who are like, let's just burn the earth as fast as we can. Because again, what they see as the center part of environmental policy is still human interests, which can only exist if there is an environment by which that is possible. The second view that we have here, the biocentric point of view, a lot of people try to figure out, well, what makes this point of view different from ecofeminism, and I will talk about that when I get to the ecofeminism one. But if you think about this for a moment, just intuitively, the name itself kind of spells out the policy, which again is the idea that life is the center of all environmental policy. And so human beings are a subset of life, and so we have an obligation to help sustain life. But the environment is important not because it supports human beings per se, but because it supports all of life. And so again, sometimes you'll see some overlap of biocentric conservative principles with anthropocentric conservative principles, because both are concerned with human beings. But the difference is that biocentric principles also want to extend that to all of life. And there are a number of different approaches from a biocentric point of view. So I mentioned that sometimes this is also referred to as deep ecology. And a deep ecological point of view would kind of go a little bit further in a critique of things like capitalism, which has a very production-centered focus, and would look at the phenomenon of things like the deforestation throughout the world of any place that has been deeply colonized, to point out the fact that it seems as though part of what we mean by being a human being is changing, is evolving based off of the domination of the environment that exists. And so again, if we think of life as this large continuation of many different species and not just as what's important to us, we're going to see that that there are certain things that exist for which we don't have a good replacement. So, even if we were able to do like, the Star Trek holodeck where we can recreate, right, a graphic kind of image of what nature looks like, that doesn't allow us to be able to understand like the behavior patterns of species that, we're just beginning to kind of scratch the surface of talking about. And in looking at this, I'd point out that there's a lot of different arguments that go with biocentrism that we've already kind of discussed here as well. So, another kind of variation of divine command theory says that, right, like not only did God, right, make man, right, but God made man to keep and care for the environment. And again, because it's a divine command theory, like that doesn't just extend to like a Christian tradition, but that can be found in most of the Abrahamic all the Abrahamic traditions, and it can also be found in a lot of other variations. I think Jainism is a really kind of good example of the biocentric point of view, where they'll use these kind of special brushes to make sure they're not destroying right like the environment as they move through it. And there are other arguments that we can look at. Again, I wanted to integrate a little bit of the metaethical point of view that we were talking about this last week. But if we go back to the utilitarian argument, Peter Singer is probably the most famous philosopher in this regard, who talks about how we should minimize the suffering of other animals by minimizing the human footprint. So we shouldn't be doing like test experiments on other animals if it's going to bring them significant harm. And when we do things like cancer studies and we are looking at vaccines like we are currently, we should be mindful of not only the human life that is involved, but also the other animals that we're harming in the process. And then finally, the ethics of care, right, is probably the biggest argument that exists from an ethics of care through a biocentric standpoint, is this one, right? That all beings are interconnected, and that they require a deep caring relationship to continue this ecological equilibrium. I promise you we will look more in depth into this, but there are a number of symbiotic relationships within nature that affirm the caringness of other individuals. And again, there's this big question: is like our main survival instinct, is it a selfish one or is it a caring one? And there seems to be some good evidence that if our main survival instinct is selfishness over caring, right, there seems to be some major problems with how it's possible to survive beyond a minimum kind of like age and time period. It seems that caring is a much more winning strategy than self-care, self-interested behavior, like extreme self-care and self-interested behavior, of course, because the ethics of care still maintain that caring for yourself is part of, right, caring for others as well. But anyway, the last point of view here, I just kind of put together the arguments with the point of view, is ecofeminism. And what I'd point out about this is that ecofeminism doesn't always use this language of like Mother Earth, right? It's not just people who are like chaining themselves to trees and being like, don't cut down here, right? But this paradigm that we've talked about making sure that things are not categorized in terms of like domination and submission is very apparent in ecofeminism. And so ecofeminism, right, sees that the environment should not be exploited, right, and it should not really be used for a single interest, but again, it should be seen as a mutual sort of partner. When we talk about space exploration, one of the main differences that you could think about between a biocentric point of view and an ecofeminist point of view is that biocentric individuals think that it's perfectly compatible that we extend life beyond this planet. And of course, there are some people in a biocentric point of view who would say that it's improper for us to extend a life that's meant for Earth to a planet that has a different form of life that's on there. But ecofeminists, like overwhelmingly, would be against that principle because it's showing this kind of domination of life over another planet, right? Which like has to be in some ways submissive towards the goal of extending life. And so it also sees the environment as intrinsically valuable, the same way that biocentrism does. But in the biocentric point of view, the intrinsic value of the environment is tied to the fact that it's life giving. And from an ecofeminist point of view, the intrinsic value is tied a lot more to the fact that it's nurturing. And sometimes that can be a distinction without a difference. But going to what I was talking about like space exploration, sometimes that difference can matter as well. Again, both of them still think that the environment is valuable for its own sake. But they think that for different reasons. In a similar way that Mill thinks that happiness is intrinsically valuable, and Aristotle thinks that happiness is intrinsically valuable, but they both arrive at that conclusion from different points of view. Similarly, ecofeminism and biocentrism again think the environment is intrinsically valuable, but again they arrive at that conclusion from different points of view as well. And so if we look at the feminist arguments that go with this, again, we think of it in terms of like the Earth should not be exploited, it should not be dominated, right? Just because it's advantageous for us to do things like dig up fossil fuels now, right? We have to think about like the overall kind of partnership that we have with the Earth. In listening to this, I imagine that many of you are probably like, okay, this is just like an extreme kind of version of environmental ethics, and this is like probably a more laughable kind of form. I'll show you some videos that I think might actually change your mind a little bit about that point of view. But thinking about this for a moment, I think it's important to grasp the fact that there are, again, not only symbiotic relationships within nature, but symbiotic relationships that human beings have with other creatures that really call into question whether or not the other points of view that we've talked about are really the proper or the right point of view. And again, if you remember when we were talking about feminist ethics, then the main idea behind that was that love is kind of the overall trumping ethic or ethos. And so the last point that I have here, loving the environment enriches the relationship one has with it. That's doubly true of the environment that one lives in. If you don't take care of the place that you live in, then there's a good chance that you'll want to move away after a while. And the Earth is limited in space. There isn't an infinite number of places to move around, although there are lots. And if we think about this, right, loving the environment seems to be a much more sustainable point of view than what would be described as exploiting or dominating the environment. Thank you, and I'll see you for the next lecture a little bit later down. Have a good one.